A valet at a hotel you were staying at for a conference once waved you toward the back of the lot without even looking up from his phone, told you self-parking was around the side, before he even glanced at what you were driving. You hadn't said a word. He just looked at the car, a 2015 Honda Civic with 210,000 miles on it, and a check engine light you've been ignoring for 8 months because you already know what it is and it isn't urgent, and made a decision about who you were before you ever opened your mouth. You parked it yourself. You didn't correct him. You never correct anyone. You're worth a little over $5 million. Not on paper in some speculative startup equity way that evaporates the day the company misses earnings. Real, boring, liquid enough if it needed to be net worth, built across 2 decades of a career nobody would recognize your name from, index funds you never panic sold, a rental property you bought in your 30s that's been cash flowing quietly ever since, and a car you've now had longer than most of your relationships. The Civic has outlasted 2 jobs, a marriage, and 3 of your friends' divorces. You're not driving it because you can't afford something else. You're driving it because you ran the numbers once, years ago, on what a new car actually costs you over a decade once you account for depreciation, financing, insurance, the whole quiet machine of it, and decided the math never stopped making sense to keep driving the one you already had. Your neighbor leases a luxury SUV that resets every 3 years, something German, something that announces itself in a parking lot. You've done the math on his situation too, not out of judgment, more out of the same compulsive number running that built the $5 million in the first place. $6,800 a month between the lease and the insurance and the financing on the boat in his driveway, against an income you happen to know, because he told you himself at a barbecue 2 summers ago, that's maybe a fifth of what your investments alone generated last year without you lifting a finger. He thinks you're the one who needs to be careful with money. He's said it to your face, gently, the way people say things they think are kindnesses. You should treat yourself sometime. Life's short. You smiled and said maybe someday. The thing people never understand about the Civic is that it isn't a sacrifice. That's the part that breaks the story they want to tell about you. They want it to be a story about restraint, about a person quietly suffering through an unglamorous car so the spreadsheet looks better, gritting your teeth through the indignity for some future payoff. It isn't that. You genuinely don't care about the car. You've never once, not for a single drive, wished you were in something else. The day you stop caring about a status symbol is the day it stops costing you anything to not have it, and that's a kind of freedom nobody who hasn't lived inside it can really picture from the outside. They assume the discipline is the hard part. The discipline stopped being hard the moment the want disappeared. Your daughter, 16 now, asked you last year, with the particular bluntness only a teenager can manage, why you make her get dropped off 2 blocks from school instead of right at the entrance. You told her the truth, mostly, that you didn't think it mattered either way, but she pushed, said her friend Madison's mom drives a Tesla and picks her up right at the doors every day and nobody thinks anything of it. You almost told her the actual number that night. You almost sat her down and showed her the account, the one that could buy 4 of Madison's mom's Teslas without noticing a dent in the balance, just so she'd stop being embarrassed by a car that's done nothing but work flawlessly for 9 years. You didn't. You told her instead that the doors aren't that far from the corner, and you'd talk about it later, and later never quite came, because some part of you isn't ready to find out what she'll think of you once she knows, isn't sure if she'll be proud or if she'll spend every day after that wondering what else you've been hiding from her on purpose. There was a contractor, a few years back, who came to quote a kitchen renovation on the rental property, walked through with a clipboard, glanced at the Civic in the driveway on his way in, and gave you a number that, you found out later from a neighbor who'd used the same crew, was nearly double what he'd quoted for an almost identical job 2 streets over. You didn't argue. You didn't even mention it. You just thanked him for his time, called 3 more contractors, and went with the one whose number made sense, the same quiet workaround you've used your whole life whenever the world decides, based on a car or a jacket or a zip code, what it thinks you can be charged. You've come to think of it less as being cheated and more as a kind of tax on being underestimated, one you've gotten so used to paying in small increments that you barely notice it anymore, the way you stop noticing a hum in a room you've lived in long enough. There was a date, too, a few months after the divorce, someone you met through a friend, smart, funny, asked good questions over dinner at a place you picked specifically because it wasn't too nice, an old habit you didn't examine closely enough at the time. She asked, somewhere around the second course, what you did, and when you told her, she asked the natural follow-up, whether that paid well, and you gave her the honest but incomplete answer, said it was steady, said you couldn't complain. She nodded, recalibrated something behind her eyes you could actually watch happen in real time, and the rest of the dinner had a different temperature to it, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with a number she'd silently assigned you based on the words steady and can't complain. You drove her home in the Civic. She didn't ask about the car. You found yourself wondering, on the drive back to your own place, whether you just avoided a problem or created one, whether the version of yourself she'd been warming up to over dinner was a person who existed anywhere outside that conversation, and whether you even wanted to find out. Your business partner from years ago, the one who helped you structure the rental property deal that became the second largest piece of your net worth, still has no idea how the investment actually performed, because you bought him out 3 years in, at a number that felt fair to both of you at the time, before the property's value had done what it eventually did. He mentions it sometimes, almost wistfully, at the rare dinners you still have together, says he sometimes wonders what that property's worth now, ballpark, just curious, and you give him a number that's close enough to be honest and far enough from the real one to keep the conversation comfortable, the same instinct that's kept the Civic in your driveway for 9 years. The instinct that would rather manage what people think than deal with what they'd feel if they knew the whole truth of it. There's a version of this where the Civic is a flex, the rich person who's too cool to care about cars, performing humility for an audience. That's not what this is either. Nobody's watching. That's the whole point you keep trying and failing to explain to people who find out, the few who do, usually by accident, usually because a financial advisor at a dinner party let something slip they shouldn't have, or because someone saw a property tax document they weren't supposed to see. Once they know, they always ask the same question, in some version or another. Why don't you enjoy it? As if enjoying it has only ever meant one specific, expensive, visible thing. Your ex-wife found out 2 years after the divorce was finalized, long after the settlement had already been negotiated based on the income she knew about, not the assets she didn't. You'd built most of the $5 million quietly during the marriage, contributing to accounts she never looked at because she trusted you with the finances and never asked, and you never volunteered. When she found out, through a mutual friend who mentioned the rental property in passing, she called you, furious in a way you understood completely and still couldn't fully defend yourself against. She said you'd let her live like things were tighter than they were. She wasn't wrong. You hadn't lied, technically, you just never corrected the story she was telling herself about your shared life, the same way you've never corrected the valet, or Madison's mom, or your neighbor with the boat. The habit of letting people believe the comfortable, smaller version of you had become so automatic that you'd done it even to the person who was supposed to know you best. That conversation sat with you longer than you expected it to. You'd always told yourself the quiet was about discipline, about not letting lifestyle creep eat the compound interest, about not wanting your daughter to grow up entitled the way some of her classmates clearly were. All of that's true. But sitting on the phone listening to your ex-wife's voice crack with something that wasn't really about money, it was about not being trusted with the truth, you understood for the first time that quiet and secretive had quietly become the same word in your life, and you never noticed the line where one turned into the other. You thought about replacing the Civic after that call. Not because you suddenly wanted a different car, but because some part of you wondered if the car had become less a financial decision and more a wall, a prop in a performance of modesty that had started protecting you from intimacy, as much as it protected your money from depreciation. You sat in the driveway one Saturday with the keys in your hand for a long time, the same way you used to sit and calculate the decade-long cost of a new lease, except this time you weren't running numbers. You were trying to figure out if you even knew the difference anymore between a principle and a habit you were too afraid to break. You didn't trade it in. You want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story ends with you pulling into the dealership and driving home in something that finally matches the balance sheet, some neat little bow on the lesson. That's not what happened. What happened is you talked to your daughter, actually talked to her, told her the real number, watched her face do something complicated that took weeks to fully settle, somewhere between disbelief and a kind of quiet recalibration of every assumption she'd ever made about her own life. She didn't ask for a Tesla. She asked, eventually, why you'd never told her, and you gave her the same answer you'd have given anyone. You didn't want money to be the thing she thought about first when she thought about herself, or about you. There's a version of you that thought, briefly, about trading the Civic in right after the conversation with your daughter, not for status this time but almost as an apology, a tangible gesture that might make up for 9 years of quiet omission in a way words hadn't quite managed to. You actually drove to a dealership one Saturday, sat in a new SUV with the salesman running through the features, the heated seats, the upgraded sound system, the kind of car that would have made the valet's decision a very different one. You sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine off, and realized somewhere in that 10 minutes that buying a different car to fix what was actually a problem of honesty would have been exactly the same mistake in reverse, solving the visible half of the problem while leaving the real half, the half about what you'd let people believe and why, completely untouched. You thanked the salesman, told him you needed to think about it, and drove the Civic home. Your accountant has asked you, more than once over the years, in the dry professional way accountants ask uncomfortable questions, whether you've considered what happens to all of this when you're not around to manage the story anymore, whether your daughter will inherit $5 million and zero context for it, a number with no narrative attached, dropped into her life the way your father's actual values never quite were because you were always too busy managing other people's assumptions to pass along your own. That question sits with you longer than almost anything else anyone said to you about money in years. You've started writing things down, slowly, not a will exactly, something more like a letter, trying to explain the Civic and the Contractor and the dinner date and all of it, trying to give her the why behind a life that's going to look, on paper, nothing like the one she watched you actually live. The Civic is still in the driveway. The check engine light is still on. You've finally got it looked at, turned out to be a sensor, $40 part, 20 minutes of labor, the kind of fix that would have embarrassed you 8 months ago if you'd let it sit because of the money instead of because of the indifference. The valet still doesn't know what you're worth, and you've stopped finding that funny in quite the same detached way you used to. There's something almost lonely now in being so thoroughly unseen, in building something real that the entire visible world has agreed, instantly, unanimously, without ever once asking, to read as nothing. Your neighbor leased a new SUV last month, the one after the German one, something even bigger. He waved at you over the fence while you were checking the Civic's oil yourself in the driveway, said something about how you really should treat yourself one of these days, life's short. You said maybe someday, the same answer you've given for years. But for the first time, walking back inside afterward, you wondered if someday wasn't really about the car at all, if it had quietly become about something much smaller and much harder than buying a different vehicle. Whether you'd ever let the people who love you see the whole shape of what you built, instead of just the dented, reliable, 210,000-mile version of you that's easiest for the world to wave toward the back of the lot.